All right, Garland Nixon here with our resident expert in all things CIA and covert operations, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Jerry Kuzmarov or Kuzmarov. I always get that screwed up. But whatever the case, he's got a great website. He's the editor over at the one and only Covert Action Magazine. All kinds of good stuff. Anything you might want to know about covert action, about the CIA and MI6, you name it. Check this out. You go here. They got all kinds of series. Look at that. 9/11, a Biden series, Israel, Gaza, the war in Ukraine, all kinds of stuff. You can keep going. Lots of great stuff there. So make sure you go to covertactionmagazine.com to follow what's happening and find out the latest. Now, we're going to be talking, we're going to go right here to a great article. Ukraine found complicit in 2014 massacre by European Court of Human Rights. Jeremy, that's an article of his. Oops. Let's talk about that. What's interesting is I got mixed emotions there, because it's like, okay, the European Council on Human Rights, whatever. I'm like, yeah, I know who they are and who they're owned by. We all knew the truth. And now they found it. I don't know why. I think it's good, you know what I mean? But at the same time, the US is like, the Europeans are like supporting the Nazis and all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's good that this has happened. Your thoughts on, well, talk to us about it. You got an article. Let's get a little background. What do we need to know about that? Some people might not even know what happened with the Odessa massacre and things of that nature, but give people a background and let's talk about your article.
Sure. Well, yeah, most people don't know about it, and this ruling was not reported in the mainstream media as well as the alternative media. The only reports I found was on the World Socialist website and the Gray Zone Project by Kit Clarenberg. It was not reported in Democracy Now! Or The Nation or Mother Jones or Counterpunch or Alternate. So, people on the left even don't know really. The focus of activism has all been on Israel, Gaza, which is bad enough, but there's been very limited activism regarding Ukraine, which is another Vietnam type catastrophe and a horrible injustice. And that is underscored in the Odessa trade union massacre. That the court, I take your point that court has been compromised and heavily Russophobic, and that makes it even greater an admission because so far everything is to blame on Russia, but now that a body of that nature is recognizing Ukrainian government complicity in this terrible massacre that set the groundwork for the war that followed. That's really a big deal, and so it should have been reported on. And the fact that it wasn't tells you something about a lot of those outlets, including alternative media. So, and the incident itself, those of us who followed the conflict in Ukraine know about it, but a lot of people don't. And this was a terrible massacre. But and one other additional point is that the money was a pittance. A lot of people said, look, 50 people were killed, and they're only giving like about 100,000 euros to the victims' families. So that's a very low sum. But what happened was a horrific massacre. You had the Maidan coup of 2014, which was a very blatant coup. And now we know that there were, with a black flag operation where these Georgian snipers with an American named Brian Boyenger massacred people in the Maidan Square, but framed the Yanukovych government to make it look like it was this brutally repressive force. And in fact, those demonstrators in the Maidan Square didn't have enough signatures for impeachment because there was an election coming up the next year, and they could have worked toward voting him out if he was such a bad guy and getting somebody more popular in. But they didn't have the signatures for impeachment, and they didn't want to wait to the election. So they used strong arm methods, a black flag operation to oust Yanukovych. And then they hunted down his supporters, and a lot of the Maidan Square protesters had been portrayed as these, champions of democracy and brave students. We've heard that in numerous contexts before. And really, there are these neo-Nazi elements. I mean, there may have been some, certainly there were some certain grievances against the Yanukovych government, and there may have been some genuine people who wanted a change, but they didn't get enough votes for impeachment. And then you have these neo-Nazi thugs who were part of the protest. And then when Yanukovych was overthrown and the U.S. helped to install the new government, ultimately headed by Petro Poroshenko, they started attacking Yanukovych's supporters and anybody who was against the coup that had unfolded. And in eastern Ukraine, the population is largely Russian-speaking and more oriented toward Russia. So those people were subjected to attack. And the Ukrainian government allowed these Nazi militias to descend on Odessa, and they started beating up the anti-Maidan and pro-Russian elements. And then they chased some into the trade union building, and then they set fire to the building. And 50 people were killed, many were injured. Some escaped the fire, and these neo-Nazis, and some of them were soccer hooligans affiliated with far-right groups in the city. And what the European court ruled was that the Ukraine government gave them protection. They did nothing. And even the fire services were very slow to respond to the fire. And they didn't give proper medical attention to the victims, some of whom escaped were beaten up by these neo-Nazi gangs. And actually, the Ukrainian government sent them to do the dirty work of suppressing the anti-Maidan elements. And really, it was for intimidation, to say we're in charge and don't mess with us. So this was a brutal act with the sanction of the Ukrainian government. Um, and the court belatedly acknowledged this and is giving some money to the families of the victims, although it's a very small amount. But it goes to show, the viciousness of that Ukrainian regime and the Nazi element that was supporting it. And this set the groundwork for the conflict that was to come, because they stepped up their attacks on the people of Eastern Ukraine, who ultimately voted for their autonomy in referendum and were setting up their own administration. And that's when the Ukrainian military moved in and continued to use these neo-Nazi elements and organize them into militias to attack often the entire population of Eastern Ukraine and its cities. And they started shelling and bombing. And the people of the Eastern Ukraine had to live often underground for periods. Their kids couldn't go to school. I mean, it was a humanitarian nightmare, but it was never covered in U.S. or Western media, and it was never covered in left media. It was a major failing, and I lost respect for shows like Democracy Now! Over this. They never presented the suffering of the people of Eastern Ukraine. And I traveled in Russia in 2018, and I learned, I'd known a bit about it, but I learned a lot during my trip to Russia. And as much as it was, you can say it was Russian propaganda, the shows I saw on Russian TV were actually well documented. They had a lot of interviews and a lot of firsthand evidence. I have a critical eye for any kind of government propaganda, but when they're presenting a lot of facts and detailed evidence with things like eyewitnesses, you start to believe it. And then other sources were corroborating thing that were presented in that Russian media. Independent journalists like Patrick Lancaster is an excellent journalist who's covered this for years. He's a U.S. Navy veteran who I think married a Russian or Ukrainian woman and lived there, and took his camera and showed what was really going on. But he never gained a voice in Democracy Now! Or the, forget about the mainstream media because we know how bad they are. But we hope better for the alternative media. But they've been really bad in their coverage of this, and very Russophobic, and blaming Russia for starting this conflict. And that's the view of a lot of people on the left, and that's why they haven't been out there protesting. But if you look at this incident, really is a key to understanding that Russia was ultimately defensive in its actions, and that it was these the Ukrainian government and these neo-Nazi elements that ultimately provoked the vicious elements that carried out this massacre and that provoked the conflict, backed by the United States, who had their own agenda of trying to draw Russia into a quagmire and use Ukraine as a kind of battering ram against Russia.
What's interesting is the discussion and the people who were involved in that massacre, who perpetrated it. You've got here, they were under the command of Andrei Purabai, the pro-Nazi head of Kiev's National Defense and Security Bureau at the time, who had been dispatched with 500 armed members of their militia on the eve of the massacre. And that's the guy. Tell us about this guy and about these Nazi organizations.
Yeah, and it goes to show, because this guy was promoted. He was sent in to oversee this massacre, and this was a coordinated state crime by the Ukrainian government and by its American supported by implication, because that regime was a coup regime put in by the United States, who had their own agenda, which is an anti-Russia agenda, because Putin was more nationalistic leader, and they want to weaken Russia and control the Eurasian region, which is viewed as key to global domination. So this guy was sent in to do the dirty work, and he was a Nazi sympathizer. And then he was promoted, and the article mentions the positions he served in. I think he was played a leading role in the parliament after this massacre. So what does that tell you about the kind of government that was put in Ukraine and being celebrated by Western liberals as this beacon of democracy, and we have to support democracy against autocracy? And that's what Bernie Sanders and what many is saying. He's still saying that. And what you and I, Garland, call the fake left, the AOC, the Bernie Sanders, Democratic Party, and a lot of people follow their line. And when you look into it, some democracy this is, where you have this Nazi goon carrying out a hideous massacre, now acknowledged by the European Court, sent there by the government with sanction from the United States. Then he's promoted in that government, and he's serving in top positions in the parliament. And that government banned, Zelensky, when he came in, banned 12 parties. And there were pro-Russian, people in Ukrainian parliament, or people who just wanted good relation with Russia and didn't want a war, and they were purged, and some were hunted down and murdered. Like Ilya Kiva was the head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine's parliament. He was forced to flee to Russia, and then he was assassinated. And the Ukrainian government bragged about it. They bragged about assassinating him in plain daylight in a Moscow park. And this is supposed to be a model democracy, according to Bernie Sanders. I mean, this is sick.
Yeah, we've got this guy now. So after that was 2014, 2016 article. He was the Speaker of Ukraine's parliament.
Yeah.
An outspoken neo-Nazi takes the reins of Ukraine's parliament as the U.S. and its European vassals remain silent. I would argue that they didn't remain silent. I would argue that at that time, the U.S. government was based on my interviews of people who were involved in the Ukrainian government, said basically told me there was no Ukrainian government, that the United States was completely in control of the Ukraine, that if you wanted a position, you had to go to give your name and it would be given to the U.S. embassy, and they would approve or disapprove of anyone who put in for any position. Anything that you wanted, it had to go to the U.S. representatives, and the U.S. representatives had to approve it, thumbs up or thumbs down. So when this guy became the leader of the speaker, of Ukraine's parliament, based on what I've been told, in order for that to happen, it would have to go to the U.S. embassy, and they would have to do thumbs up or thumbs down.
Hmm. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And, Zelensky has basically turned Ukraine into a neo-colony of the United States, and he sold off a lot of the country's best land to Wall Street banks, who are coming to totally control Ukraine's economy. So, yeah, this is really a vassal state of the United States, and it's been a disaster for the Ukrainian population, who has suffered tremendously from these policies. And it harks on something we've talked about in this show, how a quote by Henry Kissinger, that it's bad enough to be an enemy of the United States, but it's often worse to be their friend. And Ukrainian people are coming to understand that, as their entire generation of their youth has been killed, as their economy has been sold off to foreigners, as more and more regressive labor laws are being passed by that puppet regime, as you say, and they've been taken over by the far right elements, and they've lost a lot of their land. Russia has gained a lot of their land, and it seems Trump, is willing to, maybe at least he's giving the indication, acquiesce to Russian interests, and accept that Russia has taken over that land. And right now, Zelensky, Trump, from the latest news I saw, was calling out Zelensky for refusing to recognize that reality. So, I mean, Ukraine is ultimately the big loser, the Ukrainian people. And they made the fatal mistake of allying with the United States and thinking the United States was well-intentioned or something. And I've seen this, a lot of people, the South Vietnamese made that mistake. And I was recently at a conference on the Vietnam War, and they're still naive. And there are all these South Vietnamese, former ARVN, and their families and descendants, and South Vietnamese, ally of the United States, and they're still delusional about the United States and its motives in Vietnam. And I mean, their people suffered tremendously. The ARVN, one guy, an ARVN general, we watched a video, and he said, in my academy in the military, we were a class of 300, and only 10 of us survived. And, the 10 had to flee their country and try and make a new life in the United States. And, the United States didn't care at all about them. He made the point that McNamara, when they had some anniversaries, he went and met with some North Vietnamese leaders, but he refused to meet with the ARVN leaders and the former South Vietnamese leaders who were living down the street from him now in Washington. He never met them because he didn't care about them. And the United States doesn't care about the Ukrainian people. They use them for their own agenda to try and dominate Eurasia and weaken the Russians. And they don't care that they've left that country in absolute shambles and killed off their youth. Unfortunately, people need to be better educated about U.S. imperialism and how it followed the model of European empires, and they have to develop plans to safeguard themselves about it. And a textbook of what not to do is what Ukraine and its leaders did.
One of the things I find interesting is one of the things in your article, you have this guy, one of the people that reported on the Maidan coup and on the Odessa massacre, said a couple of things. Number one, CIA cash from Afghanistan heroin traffic was funneled into Ukraine and paid for weapons training and Banderas paramilitaries. The staging for the Odessa and other massacres was done at the CIA rendition site in Poland, where Ukrainian radicals were trained in torture, psychological operations, and guerrilla warfare. And lastly, Indoctrination of banderist units took place in gladiator schools, financed through GOP campaign funds, laundered via a major casino owning family deeply involved in human trafficking through macaw. Gee, I think I know who that is. At any rate, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, and it shows what you're saying. There's a huge U.S. imprint in this massacre and the horror show that developed in Ukraine. And there's this kind of Boy Scout image that was attempted, to create in the media, and that the U.S. would go there to help Ukraine. But really, yeah, they're training them in these sinister methods. They're training neo-Nazi groups to carry out horrific actions, and also training them in psychological warfare so they can try and frame it as somehow benevolent policy. But you see the dark side of the American empire, that it's really the methods of violence and torture and terrorism that have played out over generations now. And this myth of American exceptionalism is this belief that America is different from other empires and more benign and well-intentioned. But you see the methods really are the methods of violence and brute force, and that's why it results in these horrific outcomes.
Let's move on. At this point, we've got another article that I think is very important also. And I'll tell you why it's important, because there's this discussion about Harvard now. Trump is now saying, I'm going to take $1 billion from Harvard. And the question is this. The first thing I said is, they're getting $1 billion from the government. Well, why are they getting $1 billion from the government? Because it is nothing to me but an incubator for neoconservatism. Harvard promotes another warmonger to its factory, the key being another to its faculty. Now, of all people, Jake Sullivan, he's the inaugural Kissinger, how appropriate, professor of the practice of statecraft and world order. What we find is these colleges like Harvard, their job is to teach the next generation of neocons, the next generation of imperialists, the next generation of warmongers, to keep the littles and the working class in their place and to continue to operate on behalf of corporate, hegemony. Your thoughts on good old this guy, drummed out of office? They lost in a blowout, a disastrous foreign policy, and now he's teaching the next generation at Harvard. How horrifying is that?
Well, yeah, I think you said it very well. I mean, yeah, what does he have to teach students? It's a legacy of failure and other immorality. I mean, arming, genocide. I mean, the article just goes into the things Sullivan was associated with in the Biden, and he also, served in the Obama administration, and he was a top aide to Hillary Clinton, and he has his hand. Well, firstly, he was considered, according to Seymour Hersh's report and others, he was the point man for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is a major act of environmental terrorism. What if that's okay? If young people are led to believe that is okay, blowing up a pipeline, and then supposedly liberal institutions that are concerned about the environment, I mean, that fueled a major environmental catastrophe. Besides just being an act of pure gangsterism and terrorism. And this guy, yeah, had imprints under policies that have resulted in mass suffering and death, whether at the Gaza, and Code Pink was out to protest. His was giving a speech, I think, I forget at what venue, and they said he's a key figure in the arms spigot to Israel that killed, I don't know how many Gazan children, at least 15,000 at this point, I think, is an estimate I saw from UNICEF of children. I know the Lancet report had, then this is at least 8 months ago, had an estimate about 150,000 Gazans killed. So, I mean, what is your standard? I mean, I grew up, believing mass murder is wrong. This guy obviously thinks it's okay to arm a country that's just systematically slaughtering children. Ukraine, he has this huge imprint on this Ukraine conflict that we've been discussing. He was a big hawk on Syria and the Operation Timber Sycamore, him and Clinton. He's got his imprint on the Libya disaster. I mean, Libya was plunged back into a dark age, and slavery, we discussed it on the show, that slavery came back. So, I mean, these policies just have bred absolute catastrophe in so many countries around the world. And unless you're a human who has no compassion or care about other human beings, then that's okay for you. But for any of us who have any kind of human decency, I think that should be considered terrible. So, I mean, if get into Harvard, that's a great accomplishment. Why should this guy? You're going to learn from this guy who many would call for his indictment under the Hague. What kind of teacher is that? And what kind of scholarship? I mean, I'm a scholar and I'm kind of blacklisted from the academy. I spent hours and hours reading and studying an archive to produce works of scholarship that actually were very well regarded by other scholars. And there are some really good scholars out there, but they never get appointed to Harvard, as you say. They're good scholars who really trying to analyze the history of the U.S. empire and how it compares to other empires. For instance, like Alfred McCoy is a great scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, I mean, if in pursuing my education, I want to, and when I was a student, those are the kind of professors that inspired me. People like Alfred McCoy, Noam Chomsky. These are really people of high intellect and also high moral caliber. But compare that to Sullivan and the bloody footprint he's left. Is not somebody I want to learn from, or I want to send my kid who'll be applying to colleges in a few years. That's not a teacher I want them to learn from. And look at the roster at Harvard. I go into the article that it's just one of many. We can look now who's on the faculty now. At that Kennedy School, they have Samantha Powers listed on the faculty. And I did a review. She's a very poor scholar because I did a review of her book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And I have training as a historian, and I found her historical chapters to be Bush League. Never would have, not even undergraduate would receive a good grade. And at the graduate level, just be tossed out, and she would be sent to the library to do some actual research. And actually, she venerates a warmonger. In her first chapter, she venerates a war propagandist, Henry Morgenthau.
Oh, God.
And in other chapters, she presents the conflicts in kind of cartoonish way to make it look like America, did nothing wrong except didn't intervene to halt genocide, when actually they were either complicit in that genocide. There's so many cases, of course, she left out of her study. But even the cases where America was directly complicit in genocide or engaging in genocide, like in Vietnam, she leaves that out. And actually, I had the chance to attend one of her talks when I was a graduate student, and I asked her that question, and she just deflected it. It's like, why don't you pick some cases where America was supporting genocide, like Indonesia? And I listed some cases that are well documented and uncontroversial. Indonesia in 1965, Vietnam, and Guatemala in the 80s. And she just said, oh, well, there are too many. This was her answer. There are too many cases. I can't go into them all. But that would actually undercut her thesis about America not intervening. So anyway, she's just, the book is just useless from a historian and scholarship point of view. It's a politicized book that advocates for more U.S. military intervention. And she was a key figure an architect of the war in Libya. She tipped the balance in the administration in support of the bombing that plunged that country back to the Stone Age and killed thousands of people and bred misery for what had been the strongest economy in Africa. So she's currently on the faculty. There's a woman who worked for Dick Cheney's on the faculty. They have a guy, Graham Allison, who's tied to the CIA and all these big corporations. He's their guru of international relations. And then you can look historically. Yeah, Kissinger was a star professor at Harvard. back in the 50s, where he advocated for limited nuclear war, and that's what got him promotion. A lot of these people are cynical opportunists. They only care about their own career. So they realize, oh, the military industrial complex wants more war. So I'm going to write this intellectual treatise supporting limited nuclear war, and they're going to promote me to the White House. And
Didn't
that's how you rise today.
didn't
But those are kind
Obama
of professors they have. McGeorge Bundy was a dean of Harvard, and he was a major architect of the Vietnam War. But I actually show that 1900 Harvard had a president who tried to ban football because it was too warlike, and he was part of the Anti-Imperialist League, and he spoke out against the U.S. colonization of the Philippines very boldly. And this was the president, and William James, there was a faculty, a star faculty in that era was William James, the father of modern psychology, a brilliant scholar. And he was also part of the Anti-Imperialist League and condemned the U.S. invasion of the Philippines as an act of brutal piracy. So, those are better quality people who are also outstanding scholars. So, and they have a strong moral compass. So Harvard, that's what made Harvard a great university. And then they turned it over to these warmongering criminals now. And unfortunately, it's destroyed the university and the education students are receiving.
I think didn't Obama, isn't that where Zbigniew Brzezinski discovered him? I think wasn't Brzezinski a professor at Harvard?
Yeah, he moved from Harvard to Columbia. I think they didn't give Brzezinski tenure or something, so he moved to Columbia. But yeah, those are the kind of intellectual they. I mentioned Richard Pipes because the Russian field was extremely neoconservative dominated, and they had this guy Richard Pipes who served in the Reagan administration and was part of the Committee on the Present Danger and these. Think tanks that promoted this alarmist view about the Soviet Union. And other scholars, he wrote a history of the Russian Revolution and other books of Russian history. And other scholars said he was extremely biased, that he valorized the Tsarist era, and he was so anti-communist that it was not good history writing. And he was a Pole. The Poles hate the Russians, and Brzezinski was a Pole. So they pick these Poles who are so ardently Russophobic that they can't present an objective analysis, and they promote these guys, and then they run the Russian field like a mafia. That anybody, young scholars who have more objective, independent, critical view, they blacklist them and bar them from these elite universities and often from working in academia overall. And they're really a vicious spirit in academia, the neoconservatives. And I've worked in academia, and have had contact with Harvard bred professors, including where I used to teach, and they were nasty neoconservatives, and they are Stalinists. Anybody who doesn't agree with their perspective, they purge you, and they're just nasty people, and they're often poor scholars as well. So what kind of education? There's a serious problem in higher education. I don't think Trump is helping at all with what he's doing, but these problems predate Trump, and we need a serious change in universities. And I think they're key to functioning democracy is to have a university could be really a seed of lively critical debate and alternative visions taking hold. And that's why the neocon need to control the universities and purge independent radical thinkers, which is what universities are for. And they've destroyed that spirit. And this has gone on for several generations. Yeah, because we can see that there was a great start. Even Harvard had in the past some really good people, like I discussed at the end of my article, Charles Eliot, William James. These were humanists and great thinkers who've been in those universities, and the neocon have taken over, and especially in the political fields, they've barred those kind of free thinkers, and that's a detriment to U.S. democracy, and it allowed this imperialistic foreign policy to continuously go forward because the youth are not well informed and not being properly educated. And even the protest movement, as we discussed, are narrowly focused only on the Israel-Gaza, which is one horrible atrocity, but there's a lot of other terrible things that they're not addressing. And I was discussing this yesterday with somebody, and they were suggesting that these youth, I mean, they're good people. It's just that they're miseducated, and they don't really have an awareness of world affairs to broaden this movement that's developing on the campuses.
Here's something interesting because it's a line. So I'll read from, I like to read this often. This is Tony Lincoln's book, Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis in the 1980s. And he wrote, for a number of influential policymakers, the time seemed opportune to engage the Soviet Union in a round of economic warfare. Sounds kind of like today. Listen to the next sentence. Regardless of the price that might have to be paid by the economies of Western Europe and the American business community. Sounds just like today. So if you read the book, you'll understand that he was part of that group. And what he was saying is that the group that I identified with felt that geopolitical issues, geopolitical advantage, in other words, the ruling elite, that our goals were so lofty that even if the working class and the business class and everybody had to suffer to achieve our goals, so be it. It was worth it, right? Because you notice what he says, regardless of the price that might have to be paid by the economies of Western Europe and the American business community. In other words, the working class, they pay the price. Now, why do I say that? In your article, let me read something. In a speech delivered at the Brookings Institution in 2023 called Renewing American Economic Leadership, and by economic leadership, they don't mean the working class, Sullivan said that public investment should be guided by the needs of geopolitical and military power. What's he say? The other thing is, when you read the book here of Blinken, one of the things that Blinken says was, the Europeans saw, basically, I'm paraphrasing, the cheap energy that they were getting from Russia through the lens of economics. It was economically advantageous for them to get cheap oil at that time through pipelines from Russia. Whereas Blinken and his neoconservative ilk said, we saw it through the perspective of geopolitical advantage. So the Europeans were saying, we need this oil, so we'll have we'll have industry and people will have jobs and things like that. And they were saying, we don't care about that because the Russians make money off of that. Screw you guys. You can starve. You can have no jobs. You can have no industry. You can struggle. We're trying to take the Russians down. That's the only thing that's important of us. So when Sullivan says public investment should be guided by the needs of geopolitical and military power, Blinken previously has said, screw that economic stuff. This is about geopolitical advantage. You see the alignment of these neocons and their mentality that says our lofty goals of world hegemony are so important that we may have to sacrifice the economies of the working class, which they're doing today with both Russia and China.
Well, and arguably they've done that with the United States for generations as well. They've invested so much in the military. And, Seymour Melman was a brilliant economist who taught for years at Columbia University. And he wrote numerous books about how the military-industrial complex was destroying the United States economy, that it was parasitic, that it didn't produce offshoots like civilian manufacturing, all kinds of negative consequences for the economy. And of course, they've adopted more and more neoliberal economic policy that have hammered the working class and poor deliberately, while ramping up the empire overseas and the kind of policies that allow for greater investment and corporate profits overseas. So I think they've compromised the American working class and increasingly middle class, as well as populations all around the world. And it's this mentality, and I've heard you talk about as well, like Brzezinski. They talk in these geopolitical terms about gaining, geostrategic advantage, but there's no regard for the humanity of other people. So Libya, Syria, it's a great success. And then there were articles after the December, after Assad was toppled in December, in the Wall Street Journal and my other neoconservatives just like euphoric about and basically saying, "Oh, all of Israel's policies have paid off because now Iran has lost a key ally, and the opportunity there is for Israel to dominate more and more." And they're saying this is great. And there's no discussion of the 150,000 that the Lancet reported dead, the 15,000 children. There's no concern in Syria. The population suffered biblical scale calamity with the sanctions compounded by the effects of the war. You had the population just plunged back to almost Stone Age living levels and huge, child mortality, malnutrition, all rising to huge levels, and just a complete disintegration of the social fabric. And they're like joyous about this. And it's similar if you study the Indonesian genocide. The U.S. Power elite was gleeful when Suharto took over, and they said, "Oh, a few communists killed," but there were 1 to 3 million people killed. Another 1 million political prisoners, many of whom were put in prison for decades. Some of them were novelists. A lot of the people slaughtered were ethnic Chinese, and it was regarded as the CIA regarded it as one of the worst massacres of the 20th century. But they were gleeful. So it gets to your point, and I mean that's what should be discussed at Harvard or these universities. I mean, on one hand, every country does want to gain more power in the world. On the other hand, what price are you willing to pay? I mean, who's there? That's something that should be debated at a Harvard, on university campuses, and even American nationalists has to say there should be some limit. I mean, we are part of the human species. We don't want somebody doing this to us. And what page of the history book does that put us on? They're the Hitlers and the Pol Pots. Do we want to be on that page? So, but they just bring in the Sullivans, and then it's combined with this new McCarthyism, where I mean, it's the leftist, the humanist, the true liberal, who's going to raise the questions we're raising, and I think they're a very important question to debate. And for students, if these are future leaders being groomed at Harvard, they have to grapple with these questions. And we hope that we'll have some people with some actual moral conscience. But they purge and blacklist us or people like us, so the Harvard students only get the Sullivans, they only get the Kissingers now, and so these issues are never debated, and they don't even address the human cost. It's never even discussed. So they wouldn't, if they're going to have a lecture on Syria. And I know because I've studied in these schools. I studied at the Tufts Fletcher School, and I used to argue with my professor all the time. Uh, and I actually did well in his course because I did a lot of research, and he respected my work, but he was more a neoconservative, and this was in courses on Asian politics and stuff. But but anyway, I know how they cover it. Like in Syria, they wouldn't even address the human costs of the war in Syria. And if they did it all, they would blame everything on Assad, and they would never look at how the U.S. sanctions or how the U.S. Operation Timber Sycamore was part of a regime change operation and basically ignited that whole conflict. They leave that out because most of them are tied to the CIA, so they completely suppress any CIA operations or any U.S. fingerprint in causing a humanitarian calamity. So it's totally distorted the way they present it, and they purge anybody who's a truth teller. And that's a professor is supposed to be a truth teller, a real scholar or real journalist is a truth teller, and the university is a place for debate, but they've prevented that because of the neoconservative control, and that's a tragedy for our society because we keep producing these kind of leaders who think like Brzezinski and Sullivan, and we keep seeing the same awful policies and horrible consequences.
What's interesting, this is another interesting paragraph from your article. Additionally, Sullivan advocated for expanding sanctions against China. seen as the main threat to U.S. global dominance and other measures that could deny China key technologies, connections to other countries, and said the U.S. should surround China with military bases and bellicose alliances. The continuity of politics and of policy through supposedly adversarial administrations. The Trump administration is doing Biden did all of that. And the Trump administration is doing all of that now on steroids, because rather than sanctions, they're going with tariffs through the roof. But if you read that, Sullivan, what he's advocating for is what Donald Trump's doing right now. And you see, for all of the people who thought, oh, Donald Trump's coming in, he's going to fight the system, he's going to do things different. When it comes to China, he's only continued with the policy and turned up the volume on it.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no, there's no dissenting voice. I mean, on these issues, you're getting the same thing from Democratic thinkers, Republican Party thinkers, and strategists, and that's who's being sent to teach on the campuses. So, a humanist, if they want to get the student thinking critically, they could ask students question or grapple with, why is China the enemy? And that opens a big set of questions, and look at the history of U.S. empire in Southeast Asia, and the real reason China is seen as a threat and why they're trying to undermine its economy. So I mean, that's why the education system is not functioning properly, because the proper questions are not being asked. And it's just these party apparatchiks now, and pro-imperialists dominating the discourse and stifling any debate and critical thinking among younger generations or future leaders.
You also mentioned Sullivan's support for Israel war crimes continued when he called Israel airstrikes in Lebanon that killed women and children justice served, and defended Israeli military operations in Syria that expanded its illegal occupation of the Golan Heights, and also that he was one of the lead. He played maybe the leading role in the Russiagate, in Hillary Clinton's Russiagate operation.
Yeah, that's an act of deceit on the American public. So why do we want a liar, a known liar, teaching? I mean, a teacher is supposed to be, mentor, somebody who's respected, inculcates good values. I mean, that's the most important thing in education, is to broaden students' understanding of events, and to develop a good value system. And we're hiring professors who are known charlatans, liars, warmongers. This is not good. These are not role models at all. And then the students maybe learn to lie from him, at Harvard, because in that case, they are being groomed to serve in high positions, whether in business or government. And we're going to see the same pattern of lies and deceit. And, Kissinger was a well-known liar. Like, he carried out the secret bombing of Cambodia, and that devastated Cambodia. There's a quote from Anthony Bourdain, the late chef, went to Cambodia and said, anybody who goes to Cambodia will never look at Kissinger the same way again, because that country was left in ruins. And, we're just cut off. If you live in the United States, I mean, we don't see the suffering of those people. It's easy for us to just, say, oh, yeah, we're going to bomb them, they're the bad dictator. And people just, I mean, they go about their lives and they have a good life here. They're not coming in direct contact with those victims. And when you do, it's horrifying. And these are real human lives have been destroyed by these callous policies and these lies of these people like Kissinger, who are just out for themselves and their careers. And again, these are just terrible role models for students. They adopt the most regressive positions, and it become normalized. You have a Kissinger, like in the 50s, he's arguing. He wrote a book that he made his reputation arguing for limited nuclear war. And that becomes like a normal debate, when that position should be considered out of Genghis Khan. I mean, only Genghis Khan or Himmler would advocate for that. But it become normalized and respectable, and that's what students are hearing. And so that it skews our own debate, because the debate becomes Do we nuke them, or do we just send in the special forces and CIA? It's not even question, should we go in at all, or we're there to steal their resources, and maybe we need to rethink about how we structure our own society so that we don't depend on so much minerals from Africa. But that's never going to be part of the debate.
Well, and the hypocrisy of the United States starts building bases on Russia's border, and then Russia goes to war in Ukraine when the U.S. overthrew the government of Ukraine, and people are like, "Oh no, what? Putin invaded Ukraine? That's terrible. We must stand up for Ukraine. You can't just invade your neighbor. You can't just attack a country." And Trump, we might have to attack Iran. Gee, do you think we should attack Iran? I think we should. Maybe we should. Well, wait a minute. Here's the hypocrisy of the United States saying we should go across the world and attack another country. What? Because they might have nuclear weapons. Well, wait a minute. I just read articles all over the mainstream media a month ago that said the intelligence agencies in the United States collectively have determined that Iran is not seeking to weaponize their civilian nuclear program. And after the U.S. intelligence agencies collectively say they're not, the U.S. government says, we might have to attack them. Why? So they won't build the nuke that our intelligence agencies just said that they're not trying to build. And our media, no one says, well, wait a minute, we have a contradictory policy here. We need to revisit that and figure out why these two things don't. Nope. Nobody in the media asked that question. I have to ask the question. Some schlump on a YouTube show with a half a dozen people watching, I got to ask this question. And people who are on the mainstream media, none of them seem to figure out that these two things don't go together, Jeremy.
Well, they probably went to Harvard, and who are their professors, and so they're kind of conditioned not to even think of it in the way you or I think about these issues, or to raise those questions, or to see the pattern of lies, and maybe they are taught to lie. And I read a good book once by a sociologist. Well, he was looking more at corporate America and white collar crime, Edwin Sutherland, and he showed how they're taught to lie. They're basically conditioned that, like, most people are very idealistic when they start their work career, but then when they work for these big corporations, it's like they learn to become white collar criminals. So Harvard seems to be now, it's a finishing school for the elite, and they learn to lie and to turn a blind eye to atrocities, and to ultimately they lack common sense. And that's why people maybe are much smarter. Just the average people you meet, you can discuss these issues like the way we're discussing it, and a lot of people are very critical throughout the United States, and they can see some of the points you're raising or that we're discussing. But you have a hard time with Harvard students and recent Ivy League graduates having this kind of conversation. They've been conditioned not to see it that way.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. I thought you were finished. We've been talking with Jeremy Kuzmarov. He's the editor over at Covert Action Magazine. You can see it's a great website there. Lots of stuff going on. Lots of good websites. They're talking about Chile. We're talking about Ukraine. Netflix shines light on how the family Manson. Now, this is an article, a great article. Netflix film shines light on how Manson family murders appear to have been tied to CIA mind control trick, right? All kinds of stuff. A think tank makes clear minerals are the key drivers of U.S. foreign policy. That's pretty clear now. So there's a lot going on here. Lots going on. Einstein opposed Zionist colonization in Palestine. A lot of things going on here. So you got a lot of articles, whatever you're concerned with, whatever you find interesting. Covertactionmagazine.com is the place you want to go. And of course, if you click on support us, if you can afford it, to help keep their good works going. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. I really appreciate you're online also, aren't you? You have a Substack and X and stuff like that?
Yes, I developed a Substack, and it's called Too Hot for the Mainstream. And I also have a podcast, Left on Left, with Gloria Guillot.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Sorry about that, all that yawning. Just didn't get enough sleep last night. All right, and everybody, follow me on Rockfin. Follow me on Rumble, just in case for some reason the CIA/YouTube decides that they want to take down one of my videos, which has happened. You can still find it on Rockfin and Rumble, whatever the case may be, if you can afford it. Also Substack, follow me over there. And I do have my PO box in case anybody wants to mail me something there. PO Box 32. You can see that going across. If you can afford it, buy me a coffee. That's like, it just says like, buy Garland a coffee, $5 or something, however many you want to do it. And of course, you can do it monthly if you want. We got Patreon, PayPal, all that kind of stuff. Even if you can't afford it, that's okay. Make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. We're out.